My name is James Waterman. I moved to Grimshire a few months ago, seeking a quieter life, a break from the noise of Bristol. I longed for peace, a place where I could write and reflect, away from the bustle of city life. The town of Grimshire seemed perfect, isolated, quiet, and surrounded by acres of unspoiled woods. What I didn't know was that beneath this serene surface, Grimshire had a history, one that I was about to stumble into. The locals often mentioned a man named Killer John in passing, but always with a nervous laugh, as if they were trying to convince themselves he was just a legend. Thorne Ravenscar, my neighbor, was one of the few who didn't laugh when the name came up. He was a family man, a reserved type who kept to himself, but one evening, over a pint at the local pub, he warned me about the woods and the house at the top of Common Hill. "Stay away from Red Hill, James," he said, his voice lowering to a whisper. "Nothing good comes from there. People who go too deep into those woods don't come back the same." I shrugged off his warnings at first, thinking it was just the kind of folklore small towns cling to. But Thorne's words stayed with me, haunting me as I explored the town. The kids on Churchill Street were always talking about Killer John, an old man who had murdered his family decades ago and was said to haunt the old decaying wooden shack on Common Hill. To the adults, he was a murderer, long dead. To the children, he was a ghost who never left. One summer afternoon, curiosity got the better of me. I was writing in my study when I noticed a group of kids walking toward the woods. I could hear their laughter echoing as they climbed the dirt path that led to the top of Common Hill. I watched them disappear into the distance, heading toward the infamous wooden shack that loomed like a dark specter in the background. That's when I made a decision I would come to regret. I grabbed my jacket and followed. The sun was setting as I reached the bottom of Common Hill. The air was thick with heat, a rare occurrence for an English summer. The path was overgrown with weeds and the climb felt much steeper than it looked. I could feel my heart pounding as I ascended, not from exertion, but from an unsettling sense of foreboding. As I neared the top, the woods seemed to close in around me. The trees were ancient, their branches twisted like gnarled hands reaching toward the sky. I could see the wooden shack in the distance, its decaying timbers casting long shadows across the clearing. The children were nowhere to be seen. The shack was worse up close, an ancient, rotting structure that looked as if it could collapse at any moment. The windows were caked with dirt, the curtains inside drawn tight. And then I saw it, the thin plume of smoke curling from the chimney like a serpent winding its way into the sky. My breath caught in my throat. Who could be living here? I took a few hesitant steps closer, my feet crunching on the brittle grass. That's when I noticed the shed. Unlike the house, it was pristine, almost new. The contrast was unnerving, as if someone cared more about the shed than the house itself. The door to the shack creaked open slightly, just enough for me to glimpse a sliver of darkness within. A sudden rustling in the trees behind me made me jump. I turned sharply, but there was nothing there. Just the wind, I told myself. I glanced back at the shack, and without thinking, I moved closer to the door. My curiosity was pushing me, though my instincts screamed for me to turn around. I stepped onto the porch, the wood groaning beneath my weight, and pushed the door open a little farther. The interior was dark and smelled of damp rot. Dust hung thick in the air, and the furniture was sparse, just a table and a few chairs, all covered in layers of grime. But what caught my attention was the wall. Scrawled across it, in what looked like black charcoal, were the words, "He's coming." I froze. The air in the room seemed to shift, growing colder despite the summer heat. I felt eyes on me, but I saw no one, and then, from somewhere deeper within the house, I heard a creak, the sound of footsteps. I backed away, my heart racing. My hands fumbled for the door handle, but before I could pull it shut, a figure appeared at the top of the stairs. An old man, long, matted hair, a wild gray beard, and eyes as black as the night sky. His face was twisted in a grotesque smile, revealing crumbling teeth. In his hand, he held an axe. "Killer John," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding in my ears. He stepped toward me, the floorboards groaning under his weight. His lips moved, but no sound came out, only that twisted grin that grew wider and wider. I bolted, slamming the door behind me, and sprinted down the hill, my feet slipping on the dirt path. I didn't stop running until I reached the outskirts of town, my lungs burning, my heart pounding. I told David what I'd seen, but he only shook his head, his face pale. "You saw him, didn't you?" he whispered. "Killer John never left that house. Some say he's a ghost, others say he's something worse. But once you've seen him, he'll never let you go." That night, I locked every door and window in my house, but sleep didn't come. The image of John's face, that smile, haunted me. Days turned into weeks, but the feeling of being watched never left. At night, I would wake to the sound of footsteps outside my window. The smell of wood smoke filled my room, even though there was no fire. And then, one night, as I lay awake in bed, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of an axe scraping against the wood, slow and deliberate, right outside my door. I haven't been back to Common Hill since, but sometimes on a quiet night, I still smell the smoke, and I know he's still out there, waiting. It's strange how the dead of night has a way of bringing out the eerie, the unnatural. Ghosts, they say, walk by day, but they're rarely noticed, blending in with the living. But in the silence of the night, when the world is still and darkness swallows all, the boundaries between the living and the dead begin to blur. That's when you start seeing things you'd rather not see. I was never one to believe in ghosts. Like most people, I was skeptical, dismissing the tales as products of an overactive imagination. But what happened to my wife Claire and me that November night in 1998 changed everything. It was a normal evening, just like any other, in our quiet, detached home on Broom Street Road. We had lived there for 2 years, never experiencing anything out of the ordinary. That night, however, the ordinary took a sharp turn into something else entirely. We had gone to bed around 11 p.m. The house was as silent as ever. I remember falling into a deep sleep, but it wasn't long before Claire nudged me awake. She said she heard singing, voices chanting a hymn, almost as if it were coming from the walls themselves. I strained my ears, but there was nothing. I reassured her she must have been dreaming. And after a while, we both drifted back to sleep. But sleep wouldn't last long. Barely 20 minutes later, Claire woke me again. But this time, I heard it too. The air was filled with an eerie low chant, deep, rhythmic, and unmistakable. It was the sound of men singing, a sound that seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The room was bathed in a silvery light. I could see Claire's wide eyes, and we both sat up, looking around in disbelief. There, standing at the foot of our bed, were 7 hooded figures. They were cloaked in what appeared to be monks' robes, glowing faintly with a strange, silvery blue light. Each of them had thick beards, their hands clasped in prayer, as if in deep reverence. The sight sent chills down my spine. 3 of them stood on each side of the bed, but what frightened me most was the one standing right behind our heads. It was impossible. There was a wall there. Yet, he was there, unmoving, looming over us with an otherworldly presence. This ghost, if that's what it was, wore something on its head, antlers, or maybe branches, and it was the most terrifying thing I'd ever seen. I thought I heard something, a faint voice. Claire heard it too, clearer than I did. "Bring back our ways," it said, a plea, a command. I don't know how long we lay there, paralyzed with fear, but suddenly I found myself leaping out of bed, rushing to the light switch. The moment the light flooded the room, the figures vanished. Just like that, they were gone. We didn't speak for a moment, both of us too stunned to comprehend what we had just witnessed. It wasn't a dream. We had both seen them. Without a word, we headed downstairs to the kitchen, making coffee in silence. We sat there for nearly an hour, trying to rationalize the impossible. Monks? Druids? Ghosts? The area had no known history of monasteries, no tales of wandering spirits, but what we had seen wasn't a hallucination. Eventually, we went back to bed, exhausted. We slept soundly that night, but the peace didn't last. 3 days later, the chanting returned. It was just past 3 a.m. when Claire shook me awake again. The chanting was unmistakable, louder this time. I opened my eyes to see the room flooded once again with that same silvery light. This time, the hooded figure stood in a different formation. There was one at each corner of the bed, and 3 more at the foot. The one with the antlers stood among them, but this time, he held a staff, and he was pointing it directly at me. Claire shook me, but I was already speaking in my sleep, repeating the words the ghost had spoken. "Bring back our ways," I muttered. When I opened my eyes fully, I saw them, standing there motionless, surrounding our bed. I felt as though I was in another world, a world far older than the one we knew. "They're druids," I whispered. I didn't know how I knew, but it felt as though the knowledge had been planted in my mind. The figure with the staff lifted it to his lips, kissing the wooden rod before vanishing into the darkness, taking the other 6 with him. I sat up, drenched in sweat. Claire was staring at me, her face pale in the dim light. "Druids?" she asked. I explained the strange dream I'd just experienced, the one where I stood before a massive stone, watching as a man was sacrificed. The hooded figures were there, just as they had been in our room, chanting, watching, waiting. I later realized the stone I had seen was a local landmark called Thor's Stone, a place thought to be linked to ancient rituals. We never saw the ghosts again after that night, but the memory haunts me still. What did they want? Why did they come to us? I don't have the answers, but one thing is certain. Something lingers in the darkness, something that does not sleep, and something that waits for night to fall. So, if you ever hear a whisper in the dead of night, or catch a flicker out of the corner of your eye, don't ignore it. There are strangers in the night, and sometimes they come back. Thank you for joining me on this chilling journey into the unknown. If this story sent shivers down your spine, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe for more eerie tales, and ring the bell so you never miss a new video. Do you believe there are strangers in the night? Let me know your thoughts and personal experiences in the comments below. I'd love to hear them. And remember, the next time you hear something strange in the dead of night, you might not be alone. Stay safe, and until next time, sleep well, if you can.